Good morning, Biol-50. So today we're going to be talking about the muscular system. Let me activate my pen so we can get going. So the muscle system is, it's many structures actually that allow us to move. Muscles allow contraction to occur so that we can move around in a voluntary way, but muscle tissue also organizes the movement in our bodies in an involuntary way. So we'll talk about that in a bit. We're going to start with basic muscle tissue, basic kind of the microorganization of it. We're going to talk about skeletal muscle structure, something called the sliding filament theory of contraction. Now, that is an important element of studying muscles because this is how muscles actually contract at the molecular level, which is super cool. We're going to talk about the functions of skeletal muscle, what muscle fatigue is, in skeletal muscle mostly, and then the role of body systems in movement. We will be talking a little bit about other muscle types, smooth and cardiac muscle, later on. Excuse me. So the types of muscle. There are three basic types. There's skeletal muscle, which we call striated muscle because it looks like basically zebra lines here. Excuse me, my goodness. Skeletal muscle allows for really quick, powerful contractions, but then, it can be very powerful. Think about lifting something heavy. The downside of all that power, though, is that skeletal muscles get tired. They fatigue quickly. So that is part of what our metabolism is about, is allowing our muscles to do what they need to do when they need to do it and fueling them to do those actions. Skeletal muscle fibers have this cross-banding pattern. Okay, so you see they look like zebra stripes. I always think of skeletal muscle as these long strings with zebra stripes on them. Interestingly, each muscle cell is one of these long muscle fibers, and the length of the cell is the length of the muscle. So over here in Leonardo da Vinci's sketch here with the bicep, the length of the muscle cell or fiber goes along the entire length of the muscle. So even if you have little tiny dinky muscles like me, that's a heck of a long cell. Now, moving on to smooth muscle. Smooth muscle has kind of gentle contractions. Smooth muscle contracts over long periods of time. Those contractions are a lot slower and probably, definitely a lot less powerful than skeletal muscle contraction. The cells are long. They don't have this zebra banding. Okay, they don't show this cross-banding pattern, and they're tapered. So if we were to look at a single muscle cell here, they look kind of like this. Each smooth muscle cell has a single nucleus, whereas each muscle cell in a skeletal muscle actually has more than one nucleus. So on the other side of this muscle cell, right where this dark piece is, there's probably another nucleus there. We call skeletal muscle multinucleate. Multinucleate. Smooth muscle is mononucleate. Cardiac muscle is interesting because it's not, some people say it's a blend of skeletal and smooth, and that is absolutely not true. Cardiac muscle is able to undergo very quick, powerful contractions because of this cross-banding pattern again. See, look, we have zebra stripes here as well, just like in skeletal muscle. The difference with cardiac muscle, though, is that cardiac muscle fibers branch. In this picture, it's hard to see, but you can see this cardiac muscle fiber having one edge there. It looks kind of like this, and I think that's where it closes off. Okay, and so it branches off so that you have side 1, side 2, and side 3. At these branch points, you'll see these dark lines here. These are called intercalated discs. The intercalated discs actually have little holes in them that allows the electricity to flow from one cell to the next. We'll talk a little bit about how that electricity flow happens. But cardiac muscle cells also have that striated pattern like skeletal muscle. Whenever you see those striations indicate the presence of sarcomeres, and sarcomeres mean quick, powerful contractions. One of the other differences about cardiac muscle, though, is that it doesn't fatigue as quickly as skeletal muscle. Thank goodness, right? And we'll talk maybe a little bit about that later. Okay, so let's start with skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle at the macroscopic level, at the large level. Skeletal muscles typically have connective tissues at the end, which are our tendons here. The tendons at the beginning, or I guess you would say the top of the muscle, have something called origins. The origins are where the tendons attach to the top part of the muscle. Insertions, right here, are where another tendon attached to muscles, and usually the insertion has to do with the moving bone. So the origin is the origin of the mover, I guess you could say. And then, so you would say the mover, and the insertion is where the moving is happening. So each one of those tendons is made of connective tissue, really fibrous, strong, fibrous connective tissue. As the muscle contracts, one bone is moved towards the other bone. So the mover pulls the one that's moving up in this case. And so I'm sure you know what this muscle is. It's the bicep, right? And so again, the insertion muscle side is attached to the moving bone. The origin is the non-moving bone, or the mover. The muscle body itself is the central part of the muscle. When you see the kind of the roundish, kind of the biggest bump in the muscle, that can be called the muscle belly as well. Not all muscles have bellies, okay? There are flatter muscles that don't have a belly. And so the muscle body, don't confuse with the belly, because again, the belly is a rounded part of the muscle body, but the muscle body is the central part of the muscle, kind of the middle part. Okay, so now let's look at a little bit of the microscopic structure of muscle, skeletal muscle in this case. Remember that I mentioned that banding pattern. Muscle cells themselves join together adjacent to one another. So like here is muscle cell 1, muscle cell 2, muscle cell 3, muscle cell 4. They run in parallel, okay? So let's make this number 1, this number 2, this number 3, 4, and 5, okay? Sorry, they're kind of small. Each one of these runs parallel to one another, and the way I think of muscles overall, like a big muscle, is like they're like a bunch of bungee cords. If you have a bungee cord that nobody wants anymore, open it up in your garage. What you're going to see inside that bungee cord is that outer wrapping, that kind of silky outer wrapping, and inside of it is basically a bunch of long rubber bands. The individual muscle cells would be represented by those long rubber bands, all right? There is a wrapping on the outside of each one of those muscle bands, which we'll get to in a little bit, that holds them together. And basically, our muscles are like bungee cords, but we can contract them, all right? So each muscle cell runs parallel to one another. Cells, like I mentioned, can be very long. They're the length of the muscle. And each cell contains protein filaments, actin filaments, and myosin filaments. So you have the actin protein, okay, actin protein, and myosin protein, which form individual segments of the muscle. The actin and myosin organization with one another is called the sarcomere. The sarcomere is, right here, sarcomere. This is the functional unit of the muscle. So when you hear me say the functional unit, the sarcomere equals the functional unit. Sorry, I had to put the screen down so I could write on it a little bit better. All right, so one thing I want to pause for just a minute. Remember when we talked about the biomolecules that form the body? You have your carbohydrates, fatty fats, steroids and lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. This is where we're looking at actual proteins that are forming the body. When we say, what do you think of when you think of protein? Most people will say chicken, beans, things like that. When you eat chicken, this is what you're eating. The actin and the myosin and the connective tissue in the muscle. You're eating muscle. I hope I don't gross you out. Just don't think about it. Enjoy the delicious taste of your chicken. But remember, these are proteins, and it takes protein to make protein. If you're lifting a lot, if you want to put on muscle mass, what do you have to do? You have to consume extra protein, i.e. extra chicken or protein powder, or different vegetarian sources of protein are very useful as well. All right, so protein helps you make more protein, and in this case, it would be skeletal muscle. What are you building? When you eat chicken, your body digests that chicken down to amino acids, it circulates through your body, and then it's going to show up, believe it or not, at your muscle if your muscle needs to build more, and your body will make more myosin from the components of chicken myosin. Your body will make more actin based on the components of chicken actin, okay? So that's why when we are eating or eating lean proteins or taking protein powder, you need to make sure you're taking the right type of protein powder that has all the amino acids to make myosin and actin. Really important. So let's look at more microscopic structure of the muscle. We'll get back to that sarcomere in a minute. The skeletal muscle itself, if we start big, this last picture was starting big right here with the muscle fiber, okay? If you start looking at smaller and smaller units, you have the individual fibers here. So here's fiber number 1, fiber number 2, fiber number 3, and fiber number 4 going in clockwise fashion. The plasma membrane is a membrane that wraps around each one of these fibers. Important elements of a skeletal muscle and muscle fibers are the other supporting elements that help the muscle contract. First of all, you have the mitochondria. The mitochondria are going to make what? Lots and lots of ATP. So here are 2 mitochondria in here and here. Mitochondria is plural, mitochondrion is singular. There are going to be nuclei. You can't see those here right now, okay? We have another structure called the Sarcoplasmic Reticulum. The Sarcoplasmic Reticulum, or SR as I denote here, stores ionic calcium. Ionic calcium is really important for muscle contraction, all right? So one of the places our body needs calcium is for muscle contraction. So it's not just that you have calcium in your bones. This is where calcium allows our body to move and be active. The myofibrils are each one of these little tiny elements, the fibril. We call them fibrils. Don't worry, there's fibril and fibers. Fibrils are the individual units here that are made up of repeating units of actin and myosin. All right, so here are myofibrils. They're bound together by connective tissue. All right, here are the sarcomeres that I talked about before. The sarcomeres are made up of repeating units between I bands and A bands. We'll talk about the bands in a little bit. And between each individual I band and A band is what we call a T-tubule. The T-tubule accepts calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and spreads it over to the actin and myosin of adjacent cells. We'll look at that more when we talk about the physiology of skeletal muscle in a little bit. All right, here we are with the skeletal muscle microscopic view, okay? Now, yes, sorry, this is green. I didn't expect this to look so weird. What do you need to know from this picture? Well, a sarcomere is made up, again, of actin and myosin filaments. The thin filaments are the actin filaments. The thick filaments are the myosin filaments. Now, I put this down here in white instead of blue because I thought you could see it a little bit better. The thick filaments and thin filaments overlap for kind of a short region here when the muscle is relaxed. Here is the Z line. The Z line are the attachment spots for the thick filaments, all right? This little line here is called titin. Don't worry about it right now. And the Z line bisects each individual sarcomere, okay? The H zone here is an open area right here. And there is kind of a thick region here. Don't worry about why that's there right now. I don't want you to have to memorize that, okay? Get rid of that. The A band is the region where the actin and the myosin overlap. The I band is the Z line and the actin alone. So what else do we have in here? We have actin and myosin, thick and thin filaments. There are two other filaments called troponin and tropomyosin. Troponin and tropomyosin are associated with actin. So I'm going to make troponin and tropomyosin here in another green color. And what they do is they look like this. They zigzag on top of actin. What are they doing? Well, one of the big things about actin and myosin is that they have what we call a high molecular affinity for one another. In other words, they like each other a lot. They like each other so much They are so molecularly attracted to one another, right? It's like a romance novel here. It's like a movie, right? Where two individuals just love each other. They are so attracted to one another. If you have just raw actin and raw myosin in a test tube, it will stick together. They are just so strongly attracted to one another. Don't worry about how. What keeps them separated in a relaxed muscle? Well, troponin and tropomyosin. I think of this as mom and dad. And let me try writing that more cleanly there. So this is mom, troponin, and dad is tropomyosin. In other words, the parents get between the two younger individuals. I don't want to say teenagers, but you know, the two individuals that want to be together. When troponin and tropomyosin are distracted, actin and myosin can get together, okay, and form what we call a cross bridge. That is what we're going to talk about in a little bit about when we get to the physiology of muscle contraction. But in the meantime, in the relaxed muscle, troponin and tropomyosin are keeping things separated from one another. All right? All right, trying to get this to move on here. Okay, so what's going on during the sliding filament action of muscle contraction? Myosin and actin get together, like I said. Now you'll see that troponin and tropomyosin are missing in this picture. What happens is myosin has these little sticky, what we call globular heads, all right? And they stick to the actin molecule and literally almost walk along the actin molecule. I'm going to post a video of what actin and myosin contraction, or what we call cross bridging, looks like. Once the muscle is completely contracted, all right, once the muscle shortens as much as it can, the H zone, as you see here, gets a lot smaller because the H zone was wide here and it's narrow here. The A band gets much larger, okay? Remember, the A band is where you have, I guess it gets smaller. Depends on how you want to look at it. The A band is thicker, the way I think about it. The A band is thicker because you have more actin and myosin crossed over each other at the end of the contraction. And the I bands come closer together, right? Because the I bands started out here, and by the end of the contraction, they move inwards. So this is how the sliding filament theory of contraction works. Now I'm going to show you this in a series of pictures with steps. Again, I'm going to post a video for you to watch this. What are the biomolecules involved? All right, we have the myosin complex with the myosin head. This is the myosin complex that has already walked, okay, the leg is kind of cocked over. And then over here is the myosin complex with what we call ATPase activation. ATP has it ready, boom, to interact with a thin filament of actin. So here's our thick filaments, right? Here's the actin helix, the thin filament, all right? So here's myosin, thick. Here's actin, thin. Here is tropomyosin. Remember tropomyosin? I had tropomyosin as the green going zigzagging around like this. Tropomyosin is going to wrap around actin, and troponin actually, remember mom and dad? Troponin is going to look like this. It's going to stud itself along the actin filament as well. Other players in this game are going to be ionic calcium, ATP, ADP, and phosphate. There's also a role for magnesium, but we're not going to worry about that right now. So how does the contraction actually happen? So the first thing that happens is an action potential, or an electrical shock, basically, arrives at the muscle. It's a nerve impulse, all right? That action potential is actually a nerve impulse. And what it does is it causes the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release ionic calcium. The ionic calcium can travel through T-tubules. The action potential can too. We'll talk about that another time if you want. But the calcium interacts with what we call the troponin tropomyosin complex. So here's a hint, guys. Whenever you hear the word complex, it means you have two proteins coming together to make something bigger, all right? So the troponin tropomyosin complex usually covers up the myosin binding site on actin. And that's what that little purple thing right there is. I know it's kind of small. Sorry about that. So usually on actin, so here's an actin bead, okay? You have a spot that the myosin head can stick to. The problem that we have here, though, I'm going to make troponin and, oh, they're not blue. Troponin and tropomyosin will be in red. When the muscle is inactive, not contracting, you have troponin and tropomyosin covering that up, all right? So myosin just can't get a hold of that actin binding site. Just won't happen. On the other hand, when you add calcium, calcium sticks to troponin and tropomyosin. So when you add calcium, add Ca2+, what you're going to have now is a change in action. So here's our actin. Here's the myosin binding site on actin. But now the troponin and tropomyosin have been moved away. It's right here. Because calcium is stuck to it. This is what we call, and guys, I'm going a little bit more depth on this. We're going college here on this. What happens is the calcium binds to the troponin and tropomyosin complex, causing it to change its conformation. What is a conformation? It's shape. So when you see a shape change, it causes this to move off of the troponin and the tropomyosin, to move off of the myosin binding site on actin. And what does myosin do? Immediately, that myosin head sticks to actin. So basically, calcium distracts troponin and tropomyosin. Calcium pulls mom and dad away, allowing actin to be available there to interact with myosin. And in that way, we have the formation of a cross bridge. So moving forward, action potential shows up, dumps some calcium on there. Here's our calcium moving troponin and tropomyosin away. So calcium here is in the little green blobs here associated with troponin and tropomyosin, opening up the active site for myosin to bind to actin. Once that happens, you have the cross bridge formed. Now, what happens to ATP? Well, ATP gets hydrolyzed. So we know that ATP is a phosphate, phosphate, phosphate. Well, what ends up happening is the myosin head hydrolyzes or cuts one of those phosphates off. So it has a phosphate, phosphate, and then it holds the other one here. That's why it says plus P, all right? Usually myosin's just hanging out over here. It still holds onto that P, but because that P is dissociated, what it can do, because it cut it off, it can kick the P off, and as the P moves out, the ADP also moves out, and that energy, the energy in this bond right here that was broken, allows the myosin head to change from a straight conformation to an angled conformation. This is what we call the power stroke. So the power stroke is literally the stroke that allows the actin and the myosin to move in opposite directions, because myosin is literally pulling in the actin over it. After the ADP and phosphate are removed, myosin is still stuck to actin, okay? Calcium's still sitting there. How do you get these things separated from one another? You add a new ATP, an unhydrolyzed ATP. Once that happens, that allows the myosin to pop off of actin and reset itself back to this hydrolyzed state where it's holding onto an ADP and the phosphate. Now, one of the things that happens with human metabolism after we die is that our body stops making ATP. Once we don't have any more ATP, the myosin head cannot dissociate or pop off of the actin molecule. So if there's a contracted muscle after death and we run out of ATP, you're stuck in that state. All right, not you, but the dead muscle is stuck in that state. So the dead muscle is in a state then of what we call rigor mortis, because there's no more ATP to allow the muscle to relax through the removal of myosin off of actin. All righty. So the functions of skeletal muscle, basically what do? They allow for movement. The filaments, the actin and myosin filaments, slide past one another to allow muscles to shorten. And as the muscles shorten, they do work. They produce continuous, smooth, controlled movements, all right? Hopefully they're smooth and controlled movements. There are different roles that a muscle may play depending on what part of the limb is being moved. The agonist muscle is the major muscle producing a movement. The synergist muscle are other muscles involved in moving a muscle. So you might have your biceps, which is the main agonist. There might be another muscle working in synergy with the biceps to move the arm. We'll get to that in a little bit. Antagonists are muscles that produce the opposite motion. So if the biceps are the agonist, the triceps are the antagonists. What this does is it allows the arm to move in the opposite direction. Whenever the agonist is active, the antagonist is usually relaxed. If the agonist and antagonist are activated at the same time, you still have contraction, but that's more of an isometric contraction, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So what type of function, or what do these movements allow us to do? One of the most important movements for skeletal muscle is simply posture. This is the holding of the body in a constant position without movement. It enables us to stand and sit. It's achieved by cells contracting all the time. Problem is, within a muscle, you'll have a bunch of cells that might become kind of fatigued over time. So what happens within a large muscle, say in your back, is some of the muscle fibers, the muscle cells, will be contracted while other cells are relaxed, and they all take turns. So if you think of a large muscle, like along your spinal column, okay, along the vertebral column, those muscle fibers all take turns contracting so that you may maintain an upright posture. This generates enough tension to hold the body in position without generating a whole lot of movement. You're just upright. Now, if you ask me, that's a pretty smart way of getting the job done. You have trading, basically, a group of individual fibers trading off the role of contraction. Heat production is another big job of skeletal muscle. When we get cold, we start shivering. These are small muscle contractions that allow us to generate heat. Why wouldn't you undergo large muscle contractions to generate heat? Well, when you're cold enough, I don't know if you've ever tried doing jumping jacks or jogging in place, that will warm you up if you do it for a couple minutes. Jumping jacks are particularly good at that. What happens when you do too much muscle contraction over too long a period of time? Well, muscles can run out of energy, and that's called muscle fatigue. Muscle fatigue is the decrease in muscle contraction strength due to repeated use or constant use. All right. Fatigue prevents what we call muscle rigor. If you stay in the same position for too long, if you maintain a contraction for a long time, the muscles eventually have trouble relaxing. So rigor means that you run out of ATP and you're stuck, right? And this is in a living muscle. You can do this in a living muscle. What's another what's another name for muscle rigor? Muscle cramps. The muscle cramps up, it stays contracted, and it's super painful. It's a super strong stiffening in the muscle, and the muscle doesn't relax. What you need is to get ATP in there. How do you get ATP? First of all, you stop using the muscle so you can catch up metabolically, and then you allow your muscle, you can massage the muscle, you can do a number of different, if you run out of ATP, if you've been like running a marathon, you can take, different types of sports gels or sports carbohydrate drinks to allow the quick synthesis of ATP through glycolysis and cellular respiration. Exercise. So exercise, at the beginning of exercise, we have plenty of ATP to perform what we call aerobic metabolism. Aerobic metabolism uses oxygen and cellular respiration to make more ATP. The problem is, as you keep exercising, as you keep using your muscles, you kind of run out of that. Your oxygen stores may run low if you're exercising really hard, and you might run out of glucose. what that results in is lactic acid buildup in the muscle. Lactic acid buildup is totally normal. It does make you feel kind of sore. It kind of gives you that sense of burn. In addition to that burning sensation of muscle when you're using your muscles really hard, you're sometimes damaging the muscles. You're making micro tears in the muscle. That kind of hurts as well. You get a little burning sensation from that as well. But lactic acid buildup takes time to clear from the muscle. The muscle has to pump out the lactic acid into the bloodstream. The lactic acid goes to your liver, where, believe it or not, it gets turned back into glucose. The liver is an amazing organ. We'll get to that later. So what's the role of other body systems in movement and the muscular system? Well, obviously the respiratory system brings in oxygen so that we can undergo adequate amounts of ATP synthesis through cellular metabolism to make enough ATP so that you can have enough cross-bridging and fewer cramps. Let's just put it that way. Muscles also get rid of CO2 through your respiratory system. Actually, our whole body does. Cardiovascular system transports oxygen and CO2 and nutrients for energy needs. So I'm a runner. I've been a runner for many, many years now. And one of the tricks that runners have is 15 minutes before a race, you take something with a lot of carbohydrates in it. Now, I'm not saying you sit down and eat pasta. That's a bad idea. But you can take a sports drink or an energy gel or something, and that primes your body with enough quick energy that your cardiovascular system can transport oxygen and those nice little glucose molecules around so that you can make extra energy and keep going and go faster, actually, for about 40 minutes, depending on who you are. The nervous system obviously coordinates muscle contraction because those nerve impulses are what tell the muscles to move. We call skeletal muscle voluntary muscle because you think about how you want to move. Now, how do we control the muscular system? Well, the central nervous system. We're going to talk briefly about what's called the motor unit. The motor unit is the connection between the nervous system and the muscle, allowing the muscle or giving the muscle commands to move. We're going to talk about the different types of muscular contraction, the effects of exercise on skeletal muscle, the movements produced by skeletal muscle contractions, skeletal muscle groups, and major muscle disorders. Now, before I go into the control of the muscular system, you're probably asking, Dr. Val, why didn't you talk about the heart or smooth muscle? We'll be talking about those when we talk about the cardiovascular system and the digestive system and other systems that have smooth muscle in them. We are going to be looking at the structure of those muscles in our virtual slide box. We will be discussing them in your discussion, but we will get into more of those details later in other chapters. So let's talk about how the central nervous system induces movement. So the motor neuron is the nerve that innervates or touches a muscle fiber coming from the central nervous system. The motor nerve is a bundle of individual extensions that are associated with many motor neurons. So a motor nerve basically connects many cells in the spinal cord to many muscle fibers. All right, so the thicker the motor nerve, the more muscle fibers that are being activated, sort of. There are some exceptions to that, but don't worry about it now. The neuromuscular junction is the spot where the nerve synapses on the muscle cell. It's a really elegant structure, actually. You'll see a picture of it in a little bit. So the motor unit itself is a single motor neuron in the spinal cord and any of the muscle cells that it relays messages to. It's not always the rule that a single motor neuron touches a single muscle cell. A single motor neuron can touch many muscle cells. That's something that you'll talk about in Bio-18 when you come to Merced College. Now, the fine control of movement, like writing or typing or drawing, is involved when you have fine motor unit contraction. So in other words, a single motor unit contacting many neurons gives you rough, strong contractions. Individual neurons in the spinal cord touching one or two muscle fibers, you get fine motor movement, okay? And that allows for that practice makes perfect training of the nervous system and the muscles to do something special, like writing. Now, in terms of muscle contraction, large muscle contractions. The fine motor movements you guys will talk about in Bio 18 when you get to us here at Merced College. There are two types of large muscle contractions, isotonic and isometric. I alluded to this a little while ago when we talked about antagonists and agonists. Isotonic contractions, it is not anything like, osmosis. This isotonic is different. This has nothing to do with osmosis. Isotonic contractions produce movements at a joint where the muscle shortens, okay? So when the muscle is shortening, when it's contracting, and the insertion end moves towards the origin, that's isotonic. Isometric is a contraction that does not produce a movement, very little movement. And so this, in this case, the muscle experiences an increase in tension, but not shortening. So isotonic, muscle shortens. Isometric, the muscle doesn't shorten during contraction. So how then does exercise influence skeletal muscle? Well, if you don't use your muscles, you undergo disuse atrophy. Diffuse atrophy is where the muscles shrink down because they're not used, all right? Muscle hypertrophy, so atrophy is always shrinking. Hypertrophy is always growing. Muscle hypertrophy is an increase in muscle mass, which is what we do when we go to the gym and we pump iron and we take muscle protein powder and eat chicken and all that stuff. You're trying to hypertrophy your muscle. Strength training can lead to muscle hypertrophy, okay? Can, not always though. So contracting muscles against resistance, which are the weights you're lifting, is strength training, all right? What it does is you can get muscle atrophy by increasing the number of, that should say hypertrophy, not atrophy. Ooh, I'm actually going to stop and fix that right here in front of you. How on earth? THY. I am so sorry about that. Dr. Val, bad Dr. Val. That results in muscle hypertrophy, and it gives you more thick and thin filaments within a muscle. So what happens when you're putting on muscle mass? You're not making more new muscle cells, okay? You guys in high school might be, all right? We stopped synthesizing new muscle cells by our early 20s, all right? So me, I'm way old. I don't make new muscle cells, but I can add more thick and thin filaments, hopefully. Fingers crossed, right? Skeletal muscles, usually after about your 20s, your early 20s, late teens, they don't undergo mitosis anymore. They can split if you add too many actin and myosin filaments, right? Which is hard to do. But you can get splitting, but that's fiber splitting. That is not mitosis. Endurance training is a little different. Endurance training is you're not adding actin and myosin filaments necessarily. Endurance training is where you're training the muscles to be able to sustain exercise over a long period of time. So endurance training, like me, I'm an endurance athlete. I run, even though I lift some because I'm getting old and I need to maintain my muscle mass. But that's a different story. Biking, swimming, those are all endurance exercises. Muscle mass does not generally increase very much. What does change is the number of blood vessels and the number of mitochondria associated with those muscle cells. So endurance training gives you the capability for your muscle to be much more metabolically active. So strength training and endurance training together gives you a really strong dose of muscle hypertrophy and muscle endurance. Now, here's the downside. If you stop working out, if you stop undergoing, let's say, endurance training, so let's say you're running a lot, okay, you're a runner, and you get injured. Well, what do? Well, you can't run anymore, not as much as you used to, even though runners, I know how you are, I know how I am. We try to skirt the issue. What ends up happening is the first thing that happens is you might start losing the number of mitochondria associated with your muscle fibers. All right, so they're not as active, all right? The muscles basically say, well, we don't need to maintain all these mitochondria. We're not moving that much anymore. Okay, ditch a few. This happens, some people say, as early as 8 days, 6 to 8 days after not exercising. That's probably in elite athletes, probably not mere mortals like myself. On the other hand, if you go for a long period of time of no endurance training, the number of blood vessels innervating or intercalating through the muscle tissue can actually go down. Typically, that takes a long time to happen, but individuals that are like in, let's say, car accidents and they lose their mobility, the number of blood vessels will decrease within muscle over time. So what's the best idea for maintaining muscle? Strength train some so that you can keep those thin and thick filaments and muscle fiber good and healthy, keep the number up. And endurance training, keep that muscle metabolically active. So, when you're using your muscles, what types of movements are produced? Now, we did talk about isotonic and isometric contractions, but these are more detailed descriptions of what's happening between two bones as you're moving. There's flexion, where you have a decrease in angle of two bones, anterior to posterior. There's extension. So flexion would be like pointing your toes up. Extension is increasing the angle between two bones. Extension would be pointing your toes, all right? So when you flex, you're bending things. When you extend, it can also be a bending movement as well. It can also be a straightening movement depending on what muscles you're talking about. Abduction and adduction, okay? Abduction is moving away from the body line. So if you were to put your arms way up in the air and then bend backwards, that's abduction. Adduction is movement towards the body midline. So that would be like doing crunches, like a clamshell. Rotation, that one makes sense. You're moving around the long body axis. Circumduction is where the distal end is moving in a circle. Circumduction is like, doing the circles. Remember in PE how you put your arms out to the side and then you do arm circles? That's circumduction. Supination is rotation of the forearm where the palms face anteriorly, and pronation is where the palms are facing posterior. So supination, palms are facing front. Pronation, palms are facing back. Dorsiflexion, it's like flexion and extension. Flexion of the ankle, where you're standing on your heels. Plantar flexion is extension of the ankle, standing on your toes. Flexion and extension can also describe the flexion and extension of the biceps, okay? And then elevation and depression. Elevation pushes you upwards, usually through dorsiflexion of the ankle, and depression allows you to move back downwards, usually through plantar flexion of the ankle. All right, folks, so like I said, we're going to be talking about cardiac muscle and smooth muscle, the structure and how they operate in other chapters. So spend your time really studying the structure and function of skeletal muscle, even though you're going to look at smooth and cardiac here a little bit as well at the micro level. I want you to focus on learning the structure of the skeletal muscle and the names of the basic skeletal muscle groups in the body.